It was once said of Major James Breathitt, a more daring, gallant, generous-hearted Confederate soldier never drew a saber or fired a cannon. He was a largely overlooked figure, but extremely significant to the Confederate Army's efforts in the American Civil War. The paradox of Breathitt was that he believed compassion was a virtue, yet functioned as both a doctor and an artilleryman in the Stuart Horse Artillery Battalion. His unique talents were witnessed by many soldiers, regardless of their loyalties to the Union or to the Confederacy. In the aftermath of the battles, he would care for the wounded on either side. The internal conflict of taking life and saving it, often in the same day, perplexed him as both a surgeon and a soldier.
Well, the reason I become a reenactor, where I live at in Giles County, it's kind of out in the wilderness. I bought this 50 acres of land, and when you head by land, you got to do research on who owned it and all this. Well, to come and find out, it was my great-great-grandfather's land. So after I've done some more research and stuff, his name was Fletcher. Well, about a mile from where I live is Fletcher Cemetery, established 1829. Well, I said, man, that name sounds familiar. I go and look, and lo and behold, I bought my great-great-grandfather's land, and he was in the Civil War. So that kind of got my interest started in the Civil War. And from then, it's just escalated. It's amazing what you can find and the way you can find it out. Most people, if their families was in Virginia, my family goes back to the 1600s, they had ancestors that's in the Civil War. I've met people and went places I never knowed I'd go. I mean, just like David with this. I met him at Gettysburg this year. It seems like it's just opened up doors to places I would have never went before in my life. And I can't say that I've ever met anybody doing reenacting that's hard to get along with. They're just nice people. Some people might have a bad image of them, think they're rebels or something, but it's just everybody that loves history and loves their ancestors and not ashamed of where they come from. 150 years ago, a lot of people didn't know about mathematics, as you had to be above the ordinary man. Ordinary soldier couldn't do it. Horse artillery is kind of like the way the Abrams tank or something works now. The Union would be set up on a ridge. The horse artillery would move in, shoot 5 or 10 shots to kind of disorient them, limber back up and move on. It wouldn't really maybe knock them out, but it would just keep them going from place to place to where they couldn't set up a static gun and knock you out. It was a mobile unit that was with the cavalry, but it was still artillery. Very unique piece. But like I say, I met David at Gettysburg, and since then I've found out that I had 6 ancestors that served with Major Breathitt at Gettysburg. I don't know if that's a coincidence or what, but it seems to me like it's one of those things just meant to happen. I mean, he's a great guy, and I appreciate coming down here and help honor Major Breathitt. Pretty big honor to get a Medal of Honor 150 years late.
The Museum of the Confederacy is one of the oldest museums in the country. It was started in 1890. It is the Confederate repository for artifacts and manuscripts. It's located at the White House of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis's executive mansion. So we've been operating for 123 years now as the central point for people who want to study the Confederacy and the American Civil War. Studying history is great, and wonderful people have talked about it. Winston Churchill said that if you don't know your past, you don't know your future. But my favorite is Thomas Jefferson, who said history is philosophy with great examples. So I think that one of the things that's interesting about studying the Civil War is to see examples of men and women in crisis, under pressure, and how they respond to that. How do they respond as human beings? And the lessons that you can learn from studying that history are as applicable in the 21st century as they were in the 1860s. We're standing on a spot here in Hancock, Maryland. In January of 1862, a Confederate force of about 10,000 men under Stonewall Jackson approached Hancock, Maryland from the opposite side of the Potomac. We're only a couple hundred yards from the Potomac River here. Now, Jackson was an aggressive man and he was tired of waiting for things to happen, and he says, I want to make something happen. So he left his headquarters in Winchester and advanced up along the Potomac and got right across the river, right over here, not a half a mile away, and said, okay, Hancock, Maryland's across the river. He opened an artillery barrage. So the Yankees were here in Hancock, Jackson across the river on the heights. They fired at each other for a while. Jackson said, you know, I can't cross that river effectively unless they retreat. They did not retreat, so Jackson finally withdraws. So that is the Battle of Hancock, Maryland, which was part of the Bath or Romney campaign. Now, Bath is a town on the Virginia side of the river. It's now West Virginia, and it's called Berkeley Springs, but it's only about 5 miles down the road. Romney is again in West Virginia now, Virginia then, and about 20 miles from here to the southwest. That was Jackson's target. Now, Jackson wanted to prove that he was aggressive, but it was a learning experience. He found out that you can only push men so hard because the whole campaign was snowfall, sleet, ice. Men were sliding off the roads, horses were falling down, and the men had a near rebellion under Jackson. So the men were learning how aggressive Jackson is. Jackson was learning you can't push him but so hard, and that is the real story of the Romney campaign or the Bath campaign and what happened here at Hancock, Maryland. In the artillery duel that happened during this battle here, again, Yankee artillery up on the hill to my right, Confederate artillery across the river and on the hills to the left. One of the cannonballs from the Confederate side struck the corner of the church about where that utility box is and chipped out a corner of the church. The church naturally was here, and you see a cannonball embedded in the side of the church today. It was embedded there a number of years ago to commemorate the battle. Now, the cannonball is not the original cannonball, and it's on the wrong side of the church, but it would have been fired by Confederates from across the river and clipped the corner of the church, falling short of Union artillery up the hill over here. Two of the prominent families here were named Breathed and Bridges, and over the years there was intermarriage, and so they're Bridges descendants of Breathed bloodlines. Major James Breathed was one of the real all-stars of the Confederate Army. There was a group of Confederate artillerymen, all with higher educations, and were just inspirations to the men. Major James Breathed was one of them. It was a Bridges descendant who put the cannonball in the church. It was a Bridges who built the church in 1845, bringing a brand of Scotch Presbyterianism to this area of the country. So it's only fitting that the Bridges family and the Breathed family have such a strong relationship with this church. Again, Major Breathed is buried just up the hill here.
If you look at Hancock geographically, it sits on a very small portion of the state of Maryland and a narrow area where there is a lot of traffic coming through, crossing over the river. It started really as a trading post in the late 1790s, 1780s, trading with the Indians. And then shortly after the Revolutionary War, Joseph Hancock came to town and set up a ferry and a trading post. Then as time moved on, the National Road pushed out towards Cumberland, and we became a transportation hub. Then you had the C&O Canal in the late 1830s. Then the railroad came later in that time, and then the interstate highway. So we've always been a transportation hub and also been a hub of commerce. And for that reason, the town has had its ups and downs. And I think that during the time of the Civil War, it was seen kind of as a critical area to try to cross into Maryland. If we look at Maryland's history in the Civil War, actually the foray into Hancock in 1862 was one of the first attempts of the South to move into the North through Hancock. If you look at it, it is the narrowest portion of the state between Virginia and Pennsylvania. So you have really a southern state and a defined northern state, and you could get through Maryland in about a mile through Hancock. It was therefore very critical for people who are looking at trying to cross to the north and possibly skirt around into Washington. And for that reason, that's why Maryland is really a border state. Loyalties are very split in this community. Later in the war, when there was a threat to ransom Hancock and to bomb Hancock, the word was sent across the lines to say, go ahead, do this, because you're going to kill more Confederate soldiers and more Confederate sympathizers in Hancock than you are Union sympathizers. A very split town. It's important to know what our past is and to understand it and try to put ourselves in the minds of those who lived that time. That's really the thing that I really enjoyed about the book, is it gave me a chance to look into the mind of the people who lived at that time, some of the real tough decisions that they had to make, and how maybe I would have reacted in the same situation. When you read a book like this, you're always looking for parallels in your life and the life of the hero in the book. And I said, well, I'm a physician, he's a physician. We both went to the University of Maryland. After our training, he went out west to look for new opportunities. I went out west to advance my training, but we both came back. Why do we come back? Because it's our home. This is where we feel comfortable. And then you get to the big conflict: is could I have done what he did? Could I have put aside my medical training and served in whatever army at that time? And that's a real difficult thing to understand. And I think that's why the book kind of is very interesting to me, in that it makes me think about it. Now, the other thing I have to remember is Breathitt was much younger than I was when I returned back. I mean, he was in his early 20s and maybe a little bit more impressionable, but maybe a little bit more passionate. And you can see the reasons why he did what he did. I don't think he was able really to split it. He had to do one thing at a time, and so you have to say, well, what are the qualities of a physician that would make a good artillerist? And I think one of the big things is you have to be a good critical thinker. You have to have some basis in science, because we know at that time, in order to operate these guns, it wasn't like today where you have computers and remote controls. You ran the gun. You had to understand angles and vectors and all those things, which he would have based on his scientific training. He had to be a good critical thinker because he had to make decisions rapidly. But the other thing is he had to be passionate. And as a physician, you have to be passionate in order to go through the training. He has to be passionate about his homeland. But I think the thing that really made him the best artillerist was that there was a certain amount of detachment. When you care for your patients, you honestly do care for them, but you have to be able to put yourself beyond the blood, beyond the trauma, in order to accomplish your goal. That is, as in medicine, is preserving someone's limb or preserving someone's life. As an artillerist, certainly a little bit different, but you have to detach yourself from what you know the cause of your action would be. And I think that's why he was great at what he did in both fields. So if we look at the history of Hancock, there were several very influential families. When the Bridges came to Hancock in about 1816, and were very influential in developing Woodmont, which is a hunting preserve, in developing the sand mines, which was a big industry here in Hancock and Berkeley Springs, and also was a very stout and very giving member of the community. They were responsible for the founding of one of the churches in town, and were very influential members of the vestry of other churches in town. So when Breathitt came back to town, he was coming into a different venue. He was coming to someone who had already had established roots in a community, and I think that this is something that he was really looking for after the war to get himself resettled.
I've spent personally 12 years of my life reading and writing on Major James Breathitt. I wrote his biography, which came out in 2006, and now I have a novel called The Broken Circle. These books have kind of made me the premier scholar on Major James Breathitt. He was an incredible warrior. Trained as a doctor at University of Maryland Medical School, but he adapted himself from a man who was set out to save life as a doctor to a man who became almost a killing machine in his use of the horse artillery for 4 years of the war. He was also an incredible leader. He was able to lead men into all kinds of circumstances during the war, and he himself would not lead these men into battle unless he himself was willing to go. He was also a compassionate man. He was trained as a doctor to save life, and in the final analysis, after he would shoot them up, he would go out and patch them up. And finally, most importantly, I think he was a man with a great Christian heart, and his soul was infused with Christ. He was a great Christian man, profoundly spiritual man. And I think that is one of the things that when he would go onto a battlefield, as Stonewall Jackson said, he was as safe in his bed at home as he was on the battlefield. Now, I've written 2 books on Major James Breathitt, over 800 pages. And I look back at the last 12 years of my life and think about the work that I've done on Major Breathitt, and I reflect on a fellow by the name of Douglas Southall Freeman, who spent 20 years of his life researching and writing on a general named Robert E. Lee. So I feel like I'm in good company, having spent 12 years of my life writing on Major James Breathitt. Ernest Hemingway said you can't write about anything that you don't know anything about. So in essence, my reenacting brought to The Broken Circle, my novel that's just been released, a sense of authenticity, a sense of realism that might not otherwise have been there if I hadn't reenacted. And of course, my academic background brought the integrity of a historian to the experience, and all of that has brought both the biography and The Broken Circle to life. For me personally, the thing that makes Breathitt so fascinating as a historical character and as a fictional character is he had a certain internal conflict that he had to wrestle with. Called as a doctor originally in 1860 to practice medicine and save lives, he ended up becoming a killing machine on the battlefields of the Civil War for the Confederates. And I felt like there was an internal conflict within James Breathitt that he had to work out and live with every day. He was able to shut down his emotions when it came to all the blood and the guts and the fighting, both on the surgery table and on the battlefield. And I think that's an extraordinary characteristic for a Civil War soldier, to have to both save life and take life in the same 4-year period, which I think makes Breathitt a fairly extraordinary character. In 2002, I enlisted the town of Hancock to dedicate the Breathitt Memorial Park. And we had a cannon that was down there on the Potomac River, and we fired the cannon across the river in honor of my great-great-uncle, Major James Breathitt. This parade today that we're having on October 12th, 2013, 11 years after I dedicated the Breathitt Memorial Park, is in honor of my great-great-uncle, Major James Breathitt, who fought in the Stuart Horse Artillery for 4 years under Jeb Stuart and with John Pelham. I am thankful for the reenactors that I have enlisted here, the 1st Stuart Horse Artillery that is here to march in this parade. Interestingly enough, on a more ethereal note, the men marching in this parade represent 20 descendants of men that were in Breathitt's battery, 3 of which are officers, myself, representing Major James Breathitt, Mary Wigfall, who is representing Halsey Wigfall, who was lieutenant in Breathitt's battery, and P.P. Johnston, Captain P.P. Johnston's great-great-grandson is here, John Pelham Johnston. So all these men and the artillerymen that will be marching in the parade, of them there are 17 privates that were in Breathitt's battery, and they are represented here today in this parade. So kind of on an ethereal, spiritual level, we have the actual people, the ancestors of the people that fought with Breathitt and made Breathitt what he was. If it wasn't for his men that were firing those cannons in the heat of battle, Breathitt never would have become the legend that he has become in the Confederate Army. The horse artillery that he worked with for all those years in the war, as a result of that, he has been awarded the Sons of Confederate Veterans Medal of Honor. And there's only 48 soldiers in the entire Confederate Army who have ever been awarded that. And because of his heroics on May 8th, 1864, at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, he is being awarded today at his grave the Confederate Medal of Honor. My family settled here in 1816, and in this store right here was the Bridges and Henderson General Store. It serviced the National Pike out the front door and the C&O Canal out the back door, starting in 1850. The Bridges settled in this area in 1816 and were cornerstones of the community for generations. My grandfather founded the Woodmont Ride and Gun Club outside of Hancock in 1906 and developed that into the premier hunting club in all of North America. Some of his guests were Babe Ruth, Gene Tooney, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover, and that's a part of this, a vital part of this community. They also established the sand mines across the river in Berkeley Springs, and those sand mines were the largest employer in this area for probably 300 miles from 1878 till 1969 when the family sold Pennsylvania Glass Sand. And it's still in operation to this day. As an 11-year-old boy, I took a family trip back to Hancock, Maryland, where my family was here in 1816, to see some of my roots. The historic Woodmont Ride and Gun Club, the sand mines. But in that same trip, we also explored Breathitt's grave, which is at the St. Thomas Episcopal Church up on the hill, and in Berkeley Springs visited Fruit Hill Manor, which was where Breathitt was actually born. So from 11 years old, we went from here to Gettysburg. And at the Gettysburg National Battlefield on the East Cavalry Battlefield, I remember vividly going to a cannon marker on that battlefield, which was Breathitt's position in the Battle of Gettysburg. And it made an indelible mark in my mind that I've always remembered. But it wasn't until the year 2000 that a cousin of mine in Berkeley Springs gave me the papers of Breathitt as primary documents. And at that point in time, I was fascinated by who the man was. As a result, I've spent 10 years on the Civil War reenacting fields of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And I rode cavalry, and I fought with this saber. As you can see, there's a lot of chinks in that. That's 10 years of fighting from a horse and fighting Yankees in Civil War reenactments. And that was about as real as it gets. Everything but the bullets. There were no bullets flying, thank goodness. And as I work now as a chaplain at Hunter Holmes McGuire Veterans Hospital, I'm meeting with real veterans that fought in our American wars to provide the liberty that we have today. So I understand the difference between reenacting and real veterans that defended our liberties in our country of America. But my reenacting experience put me in touch with the spirit of James Breathitt on battlefields all over these states that the Army of Northern Virginia fought in. He was in 70 battle skirmishes and engagements. And many of these battlefields where I would be camped out, I would put my tent in the exact same spot that Breathitt camped in. So over that 10-year period, I encountered what I refer to as the spirit of James Breathitt in many places. I walked in his footsteps, I rode the same battlefields that he rode on. And I further enhanced my understanding of James Breathitt.
The Union Army used this building as a hospital from 1861 to 1862, about 18 months' time. After they were able to thwart Stonewall Jackson and his troops from the other side of the Potomac River in a battle or a skirmish that took place here in January of 1861 under snowy conditions. And the hospital continued to be here then for that period of time.
All of these books have a religious tone to them in that they are American historical religious studies that I learned from Dr. Martin Marty at University of Chicago Divinity School. So I think the Bridges and the Breathitts were very devout, faithful people. They worked hard. As a result of their labor, they saw God's blessing in their life, and they were thankful to God. And that inspire them to work harder and to give back and to build this community. In my new book, The Broken Circle, the life of Major James Breathitt is told in stories of faith, romance, and the turmoil of war. Civil War-era novelist Thomas Nelson Page was heard to have said of Breathitt, "He was the romance of the Southland." Discover the man and his love, Molly McGill, as they navigate life in one of the most turbulent times in American history, the American Civil War period.